Hello readers by eyes and by ears, this is Mighty Chen and welcome back to my YouTube channel. Today we are continuing with the reading of The Disabled Tyrant's Beloved Pet Fish, Volume 3, also known as 残疾暴君的掌心鱼宠 by Xue Shan Fei Hu, and we're covering at least 3 chapters, we'll see, maybe a 4th one. Anyway, I hope you all enjoy. Chapter 97, Merman Play. You bastard! Do you think you're fishing? Li Yu giggled at the method Prince Jing had chosen to pat him. He paused, then used his fin to grab the corner of the sleeve of the bamboo pole. Prince Jing tried to pull the bamboo pole back, and Li Yu moved with it to stop in front of him. Prince Jing wasn't fishing, but Li Yu was hooked. Prince Jing let go of the bamboo pole and reached his hand out. This time, Li Yu gave up his shiny, flat, short fins, and Prince Jing held them without any hesitation. Prince Jing patted his fins. Don't be afraid. This was something Prince Jing did often, so there was no way Li Yu could misunderstand him. Dummy, Li Yu thought to himself. Isn't it obvious? I'm afraid that you'll be afraid. He stopped hiding and leaped into Prince Jing's arms, the cloth still over his head. In Merman form, it was easy for his upper body to get dehydrated, but his legs and feet were still very agile. Prince Jing was afraid that he wouldn't be able to breathe, so he stayed with Li Yu in the water. Li Yu swam around occasionally. A Merman usually relied on their fins and feet to tread water, but since the water wasn't deep, Li Yu was lazy and just walked in the water with his feet. He was really taking neither fish nor fowl to the extreme. Li Yu walked around in the water playfully and even childishly splashed water onto Prince Jing before stomping on Prince Jing's feet and then trying to make his escape. But Prince Jing expressionlessly grabbed his ankles and dragged him back. This position made Li Yu recognize the danger he was in. Though his upper body was that of a fish, his lower body was still a human's. He still had all the right parts. Oh no. Would he incite Prince Jing into an animalistic fervor toward his pitiful, weak, and helpless self if he struggled? No thanks. A Merman was way too much of a turnoff, and Li Yu was afraid he might throw up even thinking about it. He didn't dare to move or think carelessly, so he just leaned against Prince Jing with the cloth still covering his head. Hugging was okay, but his cloth couldn't come off. Li Yu's mind was racing with thoughts, but Prince Jing seemed determined to stay with him through his trial. As if he knew that Li Yu didn't want his fish face to be seen, as long as Li Yu didn't try taking off the cloth, Prince Jing didn't try to force anything and treated him normally. Li Yu thus barely managed to maintain his image. The first day passed uneventfully, and Li Yu fell asleep in Prince Jing's arms. When he woke up, he realized he was still covered with the cloth and that it was the next day. The first thing he did was look down at his hands. The mission was supposed to last for 3 days, and he would switch forms during that time. The appearance of his hands was all important. He was more experienced now, and he knew that if his hand was a fin, then he must still be in Merman form. He hoped he was a merman this time, but even if he was a Merman again, Prince Jing would protect him, so he didn't need to worry about anything. It was easy to be disappointed if one's hopes were too high. Li Yu didn't want to be disappointed, so he only allowed himself a tiny bit of hope and took a quick glance. Now that it was the next day, he saw that his short fins were gone. Before him were a pair of hands with proper fingers. Li Yu suppressed his excitement and tried to clench his hands. After he made sure he wasn't dreaming, he used those hands to rub his face aggressively. His face hurt, and there were no scales. Ha! Li Yu happily tossed the cloth to the side and took in lungfuls of air. Since his face and hands were both human, then he was definitely a merman this time. Li Yu looked down at his legs. As expected, he saw a silverfish tail with gold sprinkled throughout. When he was a fish, he saw his tail all the time and never thought much about it. Now that his fishtail was bigger, though, it seemed a lot more impressive. It was almost as long as his legs, and the silver scales started about 3 inches below his navel. The fishtail replaced the legs of his human body, making for a very fetching appearance. The merman form he was in now was more like the merman he imagined at first, and thankfully not a dugong. He transformed from a food carp into a koi carp, and then into a merman. This really was quite... He wanted to cry when he was a manmer, but now, as a merman, he wanted to laugh loudly. Humans were truly irrational creatures. Li Yu admired his merman reflection in the water and started getting used to his new form. First, he rubbed his own tail. That's right, he'd never petted himself before. A merman could do something a fish couldn't do. So, this was how weird petting a fish felt. When he was done stroking it, he tried flapping his tail. His silver tail drew a pretty arc in the water, and even Li Yu himself was amazed. He wanted to try something out with his merman tail, so he wriggled up onto the shore. He could use his tail as a skateboard when he was a fish, but he wasn't sure yet if a merman could do that. Since his upper half was human, breathing out of water wasn't a problem. Li Yu did his best to stand on his tail, but perhaps because his size had changed too much, it was hard to balance. His tail couldn't support his body to walk on the ground. Next, Li Yu tried to jump. His tail strength was still the same, so he was able to get off the ground, but he was a bit unstable when he landed. Li Yu took some time to recover and then jumped up again. Even though he couldn't walk, he could move a bit by jumping around. The only inconvenience was that when he was on land for too long, his tail would become dry and sore, similar to chapped skin. However, it was much better than being unable to breathe in his manmer form, and he only had to put his tail in the water to alleviate most of the pain. Overall, the merman form was prettier and a much better deal than the manmer form. Li Yu happily jumped back and forth from land to water, loudly enough that he woke up Prince Jing. Li Yu saw his feather-like eyelashes tremble slightly and knew that he was close to waking up, so he leaped into the water and hid his tail. As soon as he awoke, Prince Jing saw Li Yu with his human upper body resting on his arms and looking at him. "Xiao Yu?" Prince Jing smiled and patted Li Yu's head. Li Yu smiled mischievously and cocked his head at Prince Jing, and Prince Jing saw a silver and gold tail rush to the surface and rise slowly from the water behind Li Yu. Surprise flashed across Prince Jing's face for a moment when he realized who the tail belonged to. Xiao Yu had fins and a human lower body before, but now it was flipped. In front of him was a young man, beautiful as always, but his lower body was now a dazzling, splendid tail. Prince Jing had never seen such a scene in his life, so innocent yet seductive, so mysterious and beautiful. This was the most beautiful Yao he'd ever seen. Li Yu had been waiting this entire time for Prince Jing to find out how beautiful mermen were. He thought to himself, and not only did he not want to hide it, he even looked forward to Prince Jing seeing him. He purposely swam slowly around Prince Jing. His tail was soft, and he would occasionally brush past Prince Jing's hands and feet. Once he was sure that Prince Jing had no plans to run away, Li Devious Yu decided to go all out and wrapped his entire tail around Prince Jing. He used to wrap his tail tightly around Prince Jing's fingers, but now he wanted to wrap his tail tightly around his body. Li Yu had wanted to do this ever since he found out Prince Jing didn't look upon his manmer form with disdain and was still willing to protect him. Opening his arms, Li Yu threw them around his husband's neck. "Your Highness, do you like it?" Li Yu asked softly, leaning in to kiss Prince Jing. Li Yu's scent was everywhere, in Prince Jing's arms and on his upper lip. He couldn't stand the teasing and could barely control himself. But he remembered that Xiao Yu was in the middle of a tribulation, so he couldn't respond hastily. Instead, with great restraint, he hugged the merman tightly, his ears turning slightly red. He had petted the tail that was encircling him countless times before. To distract himself, Prince Jing tried to pet the tail again. The tip of the tail shivered violently, and, to his own surprise, Li Yu let out an The tail was actually very sensitive. When he was a fish, petting it just felt comfortable, but when he was a merman, the feeling was amplified several times over. Li Yu could hear the indecency in his own voice. It wasn't a noise of surprise, it was practically a moan. Prince Jing's whole body stiffened. Because of that light moan, he didn't dare move. His ears turned even redder. Li Yu was still in his arms and could clearly feel the ways he was reacting. His tail began to move, rubbing with persistence. He kissed Prince Jing wetly on his earlobe and whispered in his ear, "Your Highness, do you want it?" This was probably the one time he'd get to be a merman, and it would be a waste if they just stared at each other. Sure, he was probably the first fish to want it while completing a mission, but since the system didn't do anything to stop him, it was probably fine. Prince Jing's throat bobbed. Staring into the dark, wet eyes of the person in his arms, who could resist such a sight? But he was still undergoing a tribulation. Li Yu was afraid that Prince Jing wouldn't be able to come to terms with it, and they'd waste this excellent opportunity. So he wheedled, "Your Highness, it's all right. This is also part of my tribulation." Prince Jing paused. "This was part of it?" "Yes." Li Yu smiled naughtily. "It's a love tribulation, so a carp spirit has to absorb essence." Prince Jing came back to his senses and held the restless fish. He picked an open spot next to the pond, took off his robes, and laid them out onto the ground. Li Yu lay down with his tail just close enough to trail into the water, so he'd be comfortable no matter how he moved. "Your Highness, let me tell you." Li Yu lay next to Prince Jing's ear, smiling and talking. A fish's structure was different from a human's, but Li Yu hadn't looked into it much beyond the obvious. Fortunately, Prince Jing was on board to help research the matter, and a whole new world awaited them. Li Yu's tail was so excited that it started slapping the water loudly. They finally found the right location and did everything they wanted. After the fun, Li Yu fell asleep. Prince Jing put on a random undershirt, carried him back inside, and wiped off all the gravel on his tail. Li Yu hummed quietly as he was wrapped in a quilt, his eyebrows slightly knitting together. Prince Jing examined his scales closely and found that they were a little dry. He remembered that Li Yu's tail was very lively earlier when it was in the water, so perhaps his scales were somewhat dehydrated now. Thus, Prince Jing used a wet cloth to continuously wipe his tail. Li Yu's brow relaxed, and he finally slept soundly. But before the day was over, as night approached, the sudden noise of drums and a crowd could be heard outside. Li Yu jolted awake on Prince Jing's lap. He was afraid something huge had happened, and he wanted Prince Jing to check it out. But Prince Jing didn't want to. He'd already prepared everything beforehand and had no intention of leaving Xiao Yu's side. Before long, a servant reported that bandits had taken advantage of the commotion surrounding Prince Jing's wedding to attack Luofeng village. The leader of the bandits, who'd suffered several defeats, assumed that Prince Jing would let down his guard during his wedding. Most of the officials and soldiers in Luofeng village were on vacation too. What a heaven-sent chance. A heaven-sent chance indeed. Prince Jing smiled coldly. Li Yu, who was about to push him to accept the battle, had the sense of, the weather is getting colder, so the bandits should die. Chapter 98. Tricked Fishy. Prince Jing handed Li Yu a secret report. Li Yu glanced over it and found that the ambush on the village was part of Prince Jing's wedding leave plan. The bandits wanted to attack during Prince Jing's wedding when his guard was down, but Prince Jing had already anticipated this. Luofeng village's advantage lay in its secret passages. Prince Jing had been there for nearly a year and had been training the local guards to be proficient at using those passages during battle. Prince Jing had given everyone in the village a vacation because of his wedding, making it seem as if everyone's guard was down. In reality, the security in Luofeng village was relaxed on the outside, but alert on the inside. Word had spread that the citizens were gone to visit friends and family, so if the bandits were really thinking about making a move right now, they'd make themselves an easy target. Prince Jing knew that he wouldn't be able to stay on the western border for long, so he wanted to get rid of the bandits as soon as possible so that danger could be fully eliminated. Li Yu was mostly relieved when he saw all the details on the secret report. As long as Prince Jing was prepared, then a dilettante like himself had nothing to worry about. Come to think of it, Prince Jing had made so many preparations to aid him in his tribulation that there was no way he would have been so negligent as to ignore something as important as defense. Prince Jing comforted him and handed him a note, telling him to be patient and wait for results within 4 hours. Li Yu nodded. It was almost the last day of his mission too, so he hoped that the bandits could be caught as soon as possible and nothing unexpected would happen. Outside, a fight was about to start, so he couldn't fall asleep even if he wanted to. Prince Jing hugged him, and Li Yu leaned against Prince Jing's shoulder. The two of them listened to what was happening outside. After some time had passed, the sound of children crying could be heard, as if several children were crying at once. Li Yu's hand shook, and his heart skipped a beat. He thought the crying sounded like Dabao. He and Prince Jing were in a secret residence to complete the mission, but the children had been left in the manor and weren't with them. Earlier, he'd only been thinking of the village's defenses, not his own children, but if a fight were to really break out, would they be in danger? Wang Gonggong and Ye Qinghuan were keeping guard at the residence, but would they be as wary of bandits as Prince Jing was? What if bandits broke through the defenses and rushed into the manor during the battle? Li Yu didn't dare keep going down this line of thought. Prince Jing only needed a glance to know that Li Yu was seriously worried, so he held his hand tightly and gave him a determined look. We're baiting the enemy. Don't fall for it. Wang Xi had been with Prince Jing for many years, and Ye Qinghuan was Prince Jing's cousin. They were both trustworthy. In the very unlikely event that the bandits actually broke into the residence, there were numerous loyal guards who were willing to risk their lives to protect the 4 children. Even without them, Ye Qinghuan was skilled in martial arts and Wang Xi was meticulous and careful. They were more than enough to protect the children. Prince Jing tried his best to let Li Yu know that the children weren't in any danger, but the children outside kept wailing, sounding more devastated by the sound. Li Yu's heart twisted in a knot. He was already a father. Dabao, Arbao, Sanbao, and Sibao were his own flesh, and normally, just a single tear from one of his children was absolutely heart-wrenching. Even if the children outside weren't his own, he thought of his children when he heard these cries. Li Yu held Prince Jing's hand and begged softly, "Your Highness." Prince Jing knew what he wanted. It wasn't unusual for Xiaoyu to lose his composure out of concern for the children, so the easiest way for him to calm down would be to send someone outside to see what was going on and tell them what happened. Prince Jing had actually already sent people to inquire, but they still hadn't come back for some reason. It would be quickest for him to go himself. There wasn't anything wrong with that. Prince Jing was confident in his own skills, even if he encountered bandits. But he was worried that Xiaoyu's tribulation would be affected. There was still 1 day to go. He'd heard that the biggest obstacles usually came during the final day. "Your Highness, I promise I'll stay right here and wait for you to come back," Li Yu pleaded. "Take a look for me, please." If it weren't for the fact that he was half human and half fish, he probably would have gone already himself. Prince Jing couldn't resist him and didn't want him to be disappointed. Surely, it should be safe as long as the fish stayed in the residence. On the other hand, he was afraid that Li Yu wouldn't be able to concentrate and overcome his tribulation if he was afraid and on edge. "I'll be back soon." Prince Jing agreed, and after touching the charm on Li Yu's neck and giving him a token that represented the prince's authority just in case, he strode out. The guards immediately greeted him, and Prince Jing signaled for them to protect the consort, but not to enter and disturb him. Li Yu watched him leave. After Prince Jing left, it calmed down a bit outside. Li Yu thought that Prince Jing would be back soon, but he waited a long time. Not only did Prince Jing not return, but the sound of children crying started up again. What was going on? Had something happened that even Prince Jing couldn't handle? Li Yu was extremely anxious. Having absolutely no clue what was happening outside only made him more worried. He was also worried for Prince Jing. He should have insisted on going outside with him. But he was still in merman form. Even if he didn't mind it, he couldn't walk outside. Just as that thought crossed his mind, Li Yu realized that his tail was gone and had been replaced by human legs and feet. Somehow, the third day had arrived and he transformed from a merman back into a man-mer. Turning into a man-mer right now wasn't the worst thing that could have happened. He didn't look as nice as he did as a merman, but he had his legs and feet and could move around as he pleased. But a man-mer couldn't breathe air, so he couldn't leave the water for too long, and he might scare others off with his appearance if he went out like this. There were a lot of factors to consider. But Prince Jing hadn't returned, so he had no choice but to look for information on his own. He had promised Prince Jing that he wouldn't leave the secret residence, but the situation outside and his husband's safety were more important to him. He wanted to find Prince Jing as soon as possible. Liyu's gaze fell on the cloth that he'd thrown to the side. It was a rather large piece of cloth, big enough to cover his upper body and fins. Plus, if he needed water, he still had his inventory and could bring some with him. Liu rummaged through the room and found a fish tank, put it in his inventory, and filled both the fish tank and his inventory with clear water. In case of emergency, he could take it out and put his head in the fish tank. Liu finished preparing everything and got ready to leave. The guards outside stopped him, but Liu immediately showed them Prince Jing's token. Prince Jing had given it to him so he could protect himself. Since he had the token, the guards had no choice but to let him go. Prince Jing had only thought to ask them to protect the consort. He didn't think that the consort would ask to leave himself. The guards obeyed the order and followed Liu closely. Liu didn't scold them. He was the one who insisted on leaving and broke his promise. But he should be safe with the guards watching over him. He saw a good number of people on this outing. Liu followed the sound of crying. He didn't need to go far before he ran into some people dressed as bandits, with their heads covered. They were holding something and trying to leave in a panic. Liu's sharp eyes recognized that they were holding a swaddled baby wrapped in a cloth with a golden hem. Liu's heart skipped a beat, and he ordered the guards to chase after them. There weren't many bandits, and the guards were extremely skilled, so it didn't take long for them to capture the bandits. Liu felt like he was going to stop breathing, but he still took the swaddled baby from the bandit and looked at it. This child wasn't Dabao. Liu was surprised and gave the child to a guard to look after. He ran into a corner just out of view, brought out the water in his inventory, and took some time to recover. Just as he put away the fish tank and was about to turn around, a smoke bomb landed at his feet, spewing white smoke. "Oh no, I was tricked," Liu realized as he fainted. When he woke up again, he was floating in some water with the cloth still wrapped around his head. Before he left, Liu was afraid that the cloth would fall off and he would scare others with his fish face, so he'd purposely tied a strip of sturdy leather several times around his body and found some cloth strips to hide his fins. The large cloth and cloth strips were still there. Liu remembered that he'd fainted from the white smoke. It was dangerous for him to lose consciousness as a man-mer. Why had he woken up in the water? Had Prince Jing come back to save him? There were voices by his ear. Liu quickly realized that it wasn't Prince Jing, but several other people. From their clothing, they appeared to be a group of bandits. This group was noisy. Liu listened for a while before he figured out what was happening. The bandits had just broken into Luofeng village when they'd been beaten up badly by Prince Jing's ambush. They were going to retreat to their base, but the bandit leader decided to listen to his tactician, who wanted to grab some important hostages from Luofeng village to knock down Prince Jing's confidence. This tactician had come to the western border recently and just joined this group of bandits. Somehow, he'd managed to get the head of the bandits to obey him, and at a crucial moment, on his instruction, the bandit leader didn't just try to escape, but came back to kidnap people instead. The tactician found babies about a month old and placed them in golden-hemmed, swaddling clothes. Then, he had the bandits make the babies cry, and made them run around the village to lure people out with their wailing. The bandits didn't really understand why. Why couldn't they just use the children as hostages? Why did they need to lure other people out? The tactician wouldn't explain, just insisted they should do as they were told. The first time they ran into Prince Jing, he beat the bandits up, and only a couple of them were left. In the end, the bandit leader decided to sacrifice himself and lure Prince Jing away, while the tactician had the rest of the bandits keep trying to lure other people out. But the remaining bandits were confused. When another person came out, they ended up being beaten to a pulp again. The exhausted bandits took the unconscious Li Yu to a rundown temple. Near the temple, there was a shallow river. Li Yu's leather strap was thick and hard to break, so the bandits hadn't been able to take off the cloth. Since they couldn't see him or identify him, they could only toss him into the river and hope that he would wake up soon so they could interrogate him. Li Yu had worked it out now and thought to himself that Prince Jing was right. This was a trap all along, and he'd fallen right into it. The bandits' strategists held ill intentions, and they used swaddled babies, a very particular choice. They must have been targeting him and his children, so he and Prince Jing had to be careful. They were separated. Though that initially seemed pretty bad, the guards responsible for guarding him should have realized that he was kidnapped by now. The bandits were dressed conspicuously, and Prince Jing would definitely find him soon. He'd messed up again. He hadn't trusted Prince Jing and had made his own rash decisions, but he had heard a baby's cry. If he were to do it all over again, he would probably make the same choices. Li Yu couldn't imagine himself being so reckless in the past, but there was nothing he could do about it. He was worried about his children and couldn't just stand by. A father's instinct. Chapter 99. Fishy Punishment. Li Yu was safe for now as long as he stayed in the river, but he couldn't just wait for Prince Jing to rescue him. If the bandits suddenly decided to deal with him, then it would be too late. At least now he knew Dabao and the others weren't in the bandits' hands. Plus, the bandits that caught him didn't know who he was, so they couldn't use him to threaten Prince Jing. Li Yu comforted himself with this silver lining, forcing himself to calm down a bit and consider the situation carefully. He naturally wanted to escape. Man-mers had nimble legs and feet. What if he made a break for it while the bandits were distracted? As he was thinking, a bandit came over and Li Yu did his best to hide in the water. When the bandit saw him, he swore a bit and reached for Li Yu. Li Yu didn't want to be caught, so he kicked out forcefully and managed to connect with the bandit's arm. The bandit, hit unexpectedly, became furious and drew out the sharp knife he was carrying. Li Yu started to regret not bringing a weapon with him when he left. He'd been too worried about the chaos outside and didn't think he'd be caught by the bandits. As a man-mer, he couldn't hold anything anyway. It would be nice if he had his tail. He'd never wished for his tail so much. His legs were still a bit weaker than his tail, and though the scales on his upper body provided some protection, he wasn't sure if they'd be able to withstand a knife, and his short fins couldn't even reach far enough to slap people. As soon as he'd thought that, at this critical moment, his body changed again. He'd been a man-mer just now, but his lower body suddenly felt light, as if he'd had his flowing tail. Li Yu gently flicked it to confirm the feeling. His tail really was there. Before, he'd stayed one or the other for a whole day, but he didn't think that on the third day the mission would change up the rhythm like this. Great timing! Let's handle the bandits first. The bandits slashed at Li Yu, but Li Yu deftly hid in the water. When he couldn't catch him, the bandit rushed into the river angrily, and Li Yu hid his tail in a dark spot to trip him, making the bandit fall into the water. Before he could get up, Li Yu lifted his tail up high and slapped it down on the bandit's forehead. The bandit didn't even have time to make a noise before he was knocked unconscious. Li Yu quickly dragged the unconscious bandit behind a rock. If another bandit came to check on him alone, he could deal with him. But if several came at once, he was just a single fish with a single tail and probably wouldn't be able to handle all of them. What's more, his tail could knock a bandit unconscious, but he couldn't escape with it. His goal was still to escape. Wait, Li Yu had just thought about the advantages of legs when he realized his body had changed again. His tail had once more turned into legs. It was going to change that frequently? When Li Yu was calm, he was quite clever. He started to analyze all the times he'd transformed today. The first time, he turned into a manmer when he was impatient to run outside to see if it was Dabao crying. The second time, he turned into a merman when the urge to beat up the bandits was strong. Just now, he thought about running away with his legs and turned into a manmer. So, could he transform at will on the last day? Then, he really wanted to transform into a human. Li Yu waited for a long time, but nothing changed. His fins were still short and stubby, unable to hold or grasp. It looked like he'd been wrong then. When he first started the mission, he tried turning into a human, but it didn't work. Since the fish scamming system had essentially banned the skill, it wouldn't just let him turn into a human so easily, right? If he couldn't turn completely into a human, then what about a fish? This time, it was just a casual thought, but his line of sight suddenly dropped, and his height shrank. Whoa! It seemed like he couldn't just absently think about turning into a fish, because he really would turn back into a fish. This fish form was still the original size, too. Li Yu couldn't believe his luck. The cloth end strips used to cover his body scattered and fell, and he escaped from them easily. Turning into a fish was the best-case scenario right now. Li Yu hid in the aquatic plants and coldly observed the bandits. There was no way the bandits would guess that their hostage had turned into a fish and hidden in the water. They'd only think that their hostage had somehow escaped. The bandits talked loudly amongst themselves for a while, but they finally noticed that their comrade, who'd gone to check on the hostage, hadn't returned for some time. They made their way over, loud and cursing, only to see him lying in the river. The cloth and strips that had been wrapped around the hostage were all still there, but the hostage himself was gone. What happened? Where'd the hostage go? An ill-tempered bandit pulled up the unconscious man and slapped him a few times. The bandit woke up, his eyes unfocused. He obviously hadn't seen a thing when he was knocked unconscious by Li Yu's tail. "What are you just standing around for? Chase after him!" someone shouted, and the bandits all rushed out to find the hostage. Li Yu held his breath and waited for a bit. One bandit, with his face covered, didn't leave with the rest. Instead, he walked to the river bank and searched around, but didn't find anything. He didn't give up, though. He squatted and stuck his hand in the river. Li Yu tried to avoid his wandering hand and inadvertently got a look at it. There was a scar on the man's hand that looked a lot like an animal bite. The man didn't find anything in the river. Just as he was about to stand up, a racket started coming from the rundown temple. The bandits who had run out before came running back, shouting in panic, "Tactician, it's not looking good. Prince Jing is on his way over." So, this was the tactician. Li Yu swung his tail excitedly. His Highness had come so quickly to save him. As soon as the bandits finished speaking, Prince Jing broke into the temple, covered in blood. A bandit gritted his teeth and rushed forward with a knife, but was immediately cut down by Prince Jing's sword. Prince Jing had a murderous aura around him, and his eyes were terrifying. He cut down anyone in his way, and very soon the bandits had all fallen. Only the tactician was left standing. He slowly raised his hand. Li Yu thought he was going to surrender, but without warning and a quick flash, he threw a smoke bomb. "Your Highness, watch out!" Li Yu was fearful. The smoke could render one unconscious. He'd suffered from it once before and was afraid that Prince Jing would too. Luckily, Prince Jing reacted quickly and knocked the smoke bomb away with the sword. The tactician drew his sword and stepped forward to battle with Prince Jing. Prince Jing fought for a while, but he couldn't gain the upper hand, which made Li Yu anxious. Why had Prince Jing come to save him without any of his guards? The tactician parried Prince Jing's sword with his own, and when he got closer, threw a handful of white powder at him. This bastard! How shameless! Li Yu was so anxious that he wanted to turn into a manmer and run into this disgraceful man to kill him. Prince Jing swayed a bit and lifted his hand to cover his eyes. He seemed to have fallen for the trick. The tactician coldly chuckled, knocked Prince Jing's sword aside, and then made a strange move to stab Prince Jing's calf. But although Prince Jing shouldn't have been able to see anything, in one fluid motion, he dodged cleanly, swerved behind the tactician, pulled out a dagger from his sleeve, and stabbed it into the man's back. Every move was accurate and merciless. The tactician's plot, the attempt to stab Prince Jing in the leg, and Prince Jing's dodge and counterattack all happened in a split second. You didn't. The tactician met Prince Jing's dark eyes and suddenly came to his senses. But before he could finish his sentence, Prince Jing twisted the dagger and sent him to meet his maker. Li Yu had transformed into a Merman again. He stood up from the river and rushed over like a cannonball to save his husband, only to find that Prince Jing was fine, and had even killed the tactician already. Prince Jing had noticed him, though. With his lips pursed, he strode over to him, getting faster with each step. "Your Highness!" Li Yu closed his mouth instinctively. He wasn't afraid of Prince Jing because he'd killed the bandits. He was afraid that Prince Jing was mad at him. Li Yu had impulsively left the secret residence. Prince Jing must have gone through a lot to find him. When he saw Prince Jing earlier, he noticed that Prince Jing's face was pale, the corner of his eyes were red, and he looked furious. Prince Jing had never hit him before, but Li Yu knew that he'd crossed the line this time. Li Yu knew he was in the wrong. He turned into a merman again to apologize. "Your Highness, I'm sorry." But he wasn't used to standing on his tail and almost collapsed to the ground. None of his forms were what he wanted, and he felt a bit frustrated. Prince Jing reached out a hand to help him up, then hugged him, despite everything. Li Yu leaned on his shoulder, sniffled, and said apologetically, "I'm sorry. I shouldn't have left." But he really hadn't been able to ignore the children's cries. He was a father now, and it was a father's instinct. Even if he knew logically that he should trust Prince Jing and that it was most likely a scheme by the bandits, he couldn't just let go. Sometimes logic couldn't control emotions. Prince Jing and his 4 children were his weak spot, the kind he would go crazy for, the kind where he only realized how ridiculous he was being after his impulsiveness passed. But if he had to do it again, he would make the same decision. "Your Highness, it's my fault. You can punish me." Domestic violence was no good, but Li Yu thought he deserved it. Prince Jing shook his head, hugged him with reddened eyes, and shoved something into his hand. Li Yu looked at it. It was the charm Prince Jing had given him before. When the bandits kidnapped him, the charm had fallen to the ground and Prince Jing found it. Li Yu gazed into Prince Jing's reddened eyes and lowered his own, embarrassed. Prince Jing looked at him, suddenly took his hand, and wrote on his palm, "It's not your fault. It's mine. I was late." "No." Li Yu hurriedly waved his hands. "Your Highness came in time to save me. It was my fault." "It was my fault that I didn't come back sooner and made you worry. It was my fault." Prince Jing wrote, "Your Highness, let's not fight, okay?" Li Yu sniffled emotionally. "Why didn't you come back?" "Same reason as you." Prince Jing's lips turned up in a small curve. Li Yu blinked and stared at him. After a moment, he understood. Was Prince Jing late because he also thought the bandits had captured Dabao and he had to go and deal with him? "Your Highness, do you also lose control of your emotions and get carried away?" Li Yu asked. Prince Jing nodded. Li Yu thought to himself, then we really did make the same mistake. With Prince Jing's explanation, Li Yu felt a lot better. "In the future, trust me, I'll take care of it," Prince Jing wrote. Li Yu smiled and nodded. Okay." Prince Jing didn't mention that he'd run into the head of the bandits and had a fight to the death. The golden swaddle in the bandit's arms hadn't tricked him, but when he returned to the residence, he discovered that Xiao Yu was gone. When he found the charm later, he realized that Xiao Yu had been knocked unconscious and kidnapped by the bandits. In that moment, he felt like he'd fallen into hell. Though he seemed calm, he started killing immediately. All the bandits who tormented Xiao Yu needed to die. He didn't know how much longer he would have gone on killing if he hadn't found Xiao Yu. Only when he saw Xiao Yu with his own eyes did the anger in his heart start to dissipate. He really could understand the feeling of losing control that Xiao Yu had described. When they finished talking, Prince Jing took off his outer robe, wrapped it around Li Yu, covering his fishtail, and picked him up. Everything was ready. The guards waiting outside of the rundown temple were now allowed inside to deal with the rest of the bandits. Prince Jing had entered the temple alone, with the guards outside tasked with killing any bandits that escaped. While the guards were busy with their task, Li Yu and Prince Jing secretly returned to their original residence. Li Yu and Prince Jing had just begun to watch the manor from a distance when Wang Xi spotted Prince Jing and intended to run over. But Prince Jing held out his hand to stop him while protecting Li Yu with his other hand. Wang Xi guessed that they were in the middle of something, so he knew better than to disturb them. In their room, Yeshushu, who was so bored he almost started growing grass on his head, was playing with the children. Ye Qinghuan let Sibao sit on his lap and Arbao and Sambao lay on his back while they all made faces at Dabao. Yeshutsu had sworn to make the serious, chubby little child laugh out loud, but the other three children started laughing first. Dabao thought human life was very difficult and that he would rather be a fish. Don't worry. Prince Jing held Li Yu's hand. Li Yu understood what he meant. Prince Jing wanted him to see that the children were fine. He nodded, signaling that he understood. After they watched the children for a bit, Prince Jing looked at Li Yu and raised his right hand. Was he finally going to be punished? Li Yu bit his lip and didn't dodge. Prince Jing's hand came down and patted his head softly. Your Highness? Li Yu looked at him, confused. With the punishment over, Prince Jing curled his lips into a smile. Now, they still had to overcome the tribulation. Chapter 100. Protecting the Pet Fish. Li Yu wasn't actually sure how the mission was going. On one hand, the bandits came suddenly and he rushed out in the middle, not caring about anything else. He'd only barely covered himself up, so what would he have done if someone saw him? But at the time, he couldn't care less. On the other hand, there had been no notifications from the system. From his past experience, this meant the mission was still in progress and that he probably hadn't failed yet. The system had told him before that if he failed a main mission, he would turn into fish bones and fish ash. Since he could still transform into a man-mer and merman whenever he wanted and was fine, well, no news was good news. Prince Jing put the charm around Li Yu's neck again and guarded him for the next couple of hours. During this time, Li Yu clung to him like an octopus, determined that even if the Heavenly Emperor came knocking, he wouldn't be tricked again. Prince Jing had only punished him by patting his head, which made him even more embarrassed. If it hadn't been for him, Prince Jing would have been able to kill all the bandits in a jiffy. He wanted to make up for all the worry and burden he'd put on Prince Jing's shoulders. Oh, right. Your Highness, don't forget to look into that tactician. Li Yu had heard a lot about the tactician from the bandits. Other than the fact that his face was always covered and his name was a mystery, the tactician also strategically used children and golden swaddles as bait, which was different from the bandits' usual recklessness. He felt that the tactician was probably targeting him and Prince Jing. It was well known at the western border that Prince Jing had just gotten 4 little gongzi and that the golden swaddle was only for Dabao. Ordinary people wouldn't use such a color, and it was easy to find out this information if one was interested. The tactician must have asked around beforehand. Li Yu's suspicion was logical. Prince Jing had thought the same thing. The bandits had been almost completely wiped out in this fight, and the few that were left were the ones who hadn't ventured out. Prince Jing ordered the guards to torture and interrogate them to find out who the tactician was. The tactician felt eerily familiar. Throwing white powder at him and then attacking his leg when he thought he was blinded seemed unnecessary, but in the past, Prince Jing had always kept a dagger hidden in his boot in case of emergencies. He'd brought a dagger this time as well, but he'd placed it in his sleeve during his killing rampage. It was this dagger that he ended up counterattacking with. The tactician had attacked the spot where he usually kept daggers. Was he trying to stop him from pulling it out? In any case, the tactician must have been somewhat familiar with him. Otherwise, he wouldn't have used a baby as bait. But how did he know where the dagger should have been hidden? Apart from this time, he'd only used the dagger in public once before, during an assassination attempt where his eyes were affected, after which he was saved by Xiao Yu. It was precisely because of that experience that Prince Jing had become more careful when fighting in close quarters. He'd been able to avoid the smoke bomb in time and even pretended his eyes were injured. The tactician had used powder too, just like before. Since he also knew that Prince Jing had a habit of hiding daggers, Prince Jing had reason to believe that the tactician was the one who'd attacked him that night. Your Highness, I saw by accident that the tactician had a scar that looked like an animal bite on his hand. Li Yu had a piece of evidence. He didn't know if it would be useful, but he might as well say it since he remembered it. As soon as Li Yu mentioned it, Prince Jing immediately remembered that the attacker in the palace had kept covering his hand as if he was injured. Prince Jing wrote down the events of that day. Li Yu hadn't realized there were so many details behind Prince Jing's eye injury. Your Highness, are you thinking that the tactician is the same one who attacked you that day? Li Yu asked, mulling it over. Prince Jing nodded. On the western border, his only enemies were the bandits. The tactician had only come to the western border a short while ago and wasn't previously a bandit. That meant he must be from the capital. Li Yu thought about the scars on the man's hand and the other event of the day. Prince Jing's eyes were injured. It couldn't be just a coincidence, right? Your Highness, remember the day Xiongfeng and I encountered a masked man, the one that tried to poison the fish food? Xiongfeng bit him on the hand. When Li Yu mentioned Xiongfeng, Prince Jing visibly paused before he realized that Li Yu was talking about his experience as a fish and that Xiongfeng was Ye Qinghuan's dog. Hearing Xiao Yu suddenly call out another name so familiarly had made Prince Jing a little uncomfortable, but he soon managed to turn his attention back to business. The person that poisoned the food had been bitten by Ye Qinghuan's dog, and the tactician had a scar from an animal bite on his hand. It matched. The tactician was from the capital and had run into both of them long ago, as the same person who poisoned the fish food and then turned around to attack him. Is it the second prince? Li Yu asked cautiously. When the masked man poisoned the fish food, the second prince had been plotting against the house of Changan and had asked someone to buy arsenic. Prince Jing and Wang Gonggong had thus concluded that the poisoner was sent by the second prince, who wanted to vent his anger. Back then, the second prince had been under the most suspicion. But the situation was different now. After Prince Jing had dealt with him, the second prince was left confused and mentally broken. How could a person who was out of the running for such a long time still have an accomplice? And for it to be the same masked poisoner? It didn't make sense. Prince Jing had someone in the second prince's residence keeping an eye on him, and he knew exactly what state Mu Tianzhao was in. So it couldn't be him. That only left one possibility that they hadn't thought of before, that the poisoner had never been sent by the second prince in the first place, and the second prince had only taken the blame for the event. If it wasn't the second prince, it could only be the third or sixth prince. In the past, Prince Jing might have suspected the third prince, but right now, it was hard for the third prince to even protect himself. The emperor had found out about someone passing messages between the western border and the capital under the third prince's name, and the third prince had suffered for it. Wasn't that quite similar to the way the second prince had been framed? Prince Jing thought for a while and then wrote a 6 that bled through the paper. Xiao Yu had been right. Mu Tianxiao was his biggest enemy, and he'd been secretly plotting against him for so long. So, it was him. Li Yu sighed lightly. Everything could be explained if the devious sixth prince was behind it. The tactician was loyal to the Sixth Prince. The Sixth Prince was the only person with time to come out to the west to do something like this. Before, the Sixth Prince had hidden behind the Third Prince, and before that, it had been the Second Prince. If he made a move, nobody would think of this unwanted invisible person. Now that the Sixth Prince got rid of the Third Prince and became the Emperor's only adult prince in the capital, he was in the limelight at court. But he was also no longer hidden. He had no shield anymore. Now that he knew it was the Sixth Prince's doing, Prince Jing wasn't going to hold back. A month later, the people at Prince Jing's manor in the capital received a secret letter from Wang Gongong. There was only one line on the letter. Teach him a little lesson. They would have to find out who him was through other means. That was how secrets were kept in Prince Jing's manor. These people would follow Prince Jing through hell and high water, but they'd been bored guarding the huge manor. Now that they finally had an order from their master, they immediately flew into action. Soon afterward, Jing from the Ministry of Works reported to the emperor that the Sixth Prince had taken bribes while he was in charge of repairs for Shui Palace and switched out quality materials for inferior ones. Mu Tianxiao's expression twisted as he denied it, saying he was just following regulations. Jing, filled with righteous indignation, countered him and took out the original blueprints of Shui Palace. The Shui Palace that the Sixth Prince had renovated looked the same, but it was clear that the wood used didn't match the plans. Instead, second-grade wood had been used, even for the beams. The emperor was extremely shocked. He immediately ordered the removal of the beams from Shui Palace for examination and called upon more than a dozen carpenters to inspect it. He was worried that someone might even be framing the Sixth Prince, so he chose the carpenters himself. But the carpenters confirmed that the wood didn't match the original plans. In actuality, it wasn't the first time the repairs had differed from the blueprints. It would be explained logically, if need be. But unfortunately, the numbers the Sixth Prince had reported to the emperor and the Ministry of Revenue were based on top quality wood. The accounts had one price, and reality had another. So where had the difference disappeared to? As the supervisor of the project, the Sixth Prince had to have seen what wood was being used. That was part of his responsibility. He simply had no leg to stand on. He'd just gotten married a month ago. Normally, a prince's wedding was held by the Ministry of Rites. The only exception was Prince Jing, who was in the western border and had the emperor's permission to hold his own wedding. All the other princes' weddings were carried out by the Ministry of Rites, and they were all quite similar. But it was said that the Sixth Prince had given his fiancée, Marquis Dingbei's daughter, quite a few more gifts than usual, which were all added to her dowry and carried to the Sixth Prince's manor. Marquis Dingbei loved to show off and had already made a ruckus about the gifts from his future son-in-law, the prince. Anyone with eyes could see which gifts were the Sixth Prince's. Gold and silver jewelry were considered inconspicuous among the pearls, agate, coral, jade, and ivory, which all came in boxes of 2 or more. There were countless ancient books and paintings as well, even though the Sixth Prince had claimed that he couldn't even prepare a decent gift for the emperor's birthday. And that was the problem. How could the Sixth Prince get his hands on so much money within a single year? With this prince's status and salary, he definitely wouldn't be able to afford all this. The Sixth Prince's mother was a palace maid, and her family was poor. That was why he'd always been so poor in the past. Either he'd lied to the emperor during his birthday, or the money came from dishonest means. Some court officials had suspected him before, but the Sixth Prince was the only adult prince by the emperor's side now, and his status had risen rapidly. So these officials weren't inclined to offend the possible future emperor. Even Jing had to think twice before exposing him after he received evidence that the Sixth Prince had accepted bribes. Jing was extremely familiar with the Sixth Prince's job in the Ministry of Works. When he learned that the wood used for renovating Shui Palace was different from the wood in the plans and that the Sixth Prince had never mentioned such a thing, he knew something was fishy. It didn't take much thought to work out who benefited from this. Jing ordered people to follow the servants of the Sixth Prince, and then remembered that when Zhongshui Palace was being renovated, the Sixth Prince had sent servants to pawn off some rosewood boxes. Jing put in a lot of effort to retrieve them, only to find that they were heirlooms from the imperial merchant who was in charge of wood. That showed where the Sixth Prince's money was coming from. Jing presented the pawn tickets and the pawned heirlooms as evidence. The emperor interrogated the Sixth Prince, and the Sixth Prince insisted that his confidant had done it behind his back. He said his confidant had taken the money for himself, deceived him while he was in charge of the project, and substituted the good wood with the bad. The Sixth Prince didn't suspect him because he trusted him. All in all, he managed to push the blame onto someone else completely. The emperor's expression remained icy cold as he stared at the Sixth Prince. The Sixth Prince felt like he had nowhere to hide under the emperor's piercing gaze, but he could only grit his teeth and continue his innocent act. The emperor finally accepted the Sixth Prince's explanation, but because of this, everyone around the Sixth Prince was replaced. That was another story, though. Li Yu was finally at the last stage of protecting the pet fish. The long-awaited system notification sounded, but instead of notifying him whether the mission was completed or not, it asked him to enter the system and check himself. It was a little different from how the fish scamming system usually worked, so Li Yu felt a bit anxious. He was sort of scared that he'd failed the mission. After making a brief explanation to Prince Jing, Li Yu entered the system at once. The main mission, postpartum care, was still lit up, and the protecting the pet fish step was followed by color-changing small squares that would determine the final outcome. So, this step also required assessment? The mission was for the Tyrant to protect his pet fish, the system explained. If the transforming pet fish was found by others, then it would be a fail. I covered myself so they didn't see my real appearance, Li Yu replied. It shouldn't count as being discovered, right? It doesn't count, but there were 2 bandits who were killed by the Tyrant after they saw the user's Merman form. The mission can't be classified as a success or a failure. It can only be reassessed based on the Tyrant's actions. So dangerous. Li Yu breathed a sigh of relief. Thankfully, it didn't count as a failure. He'd been assessed several times before, and Prince Jing always did great. There shouldn't be a problem this time either. Li Yu stared intently at the small square that would indicate the results. Green meant success, red meant failure. He remembered that the square had turned rainbow-colored once. What would it be this time? The little square changed colors faster and faster until it suddenly stopped. It was yellow. This was such an unexpected color. Thinking about what he and Prince Jing had done during the mission, Li Yu couldn't help but complain. Did the system think that he and Prince Jing were too horny? Chapter 101. Fish Calling His Name. The system could hear Li Yu's thoughts and was rendered speechless for a moment because of the user's derailment. Yellow means a partial pass, the system corrected him. Otherwise, the user might imagine some strange things on his own. Huh? The Tyrant used excessive violence, but it was to save the pet fish. Since the system cannot deny the Tyrant's protection of the pet fish, that is the result of the assessment. It was as if this was a test. Prince Jing had answered well at first, but accidentally spilled ink on the paper. Li Yu had expected that the system would balance the pros and cons, but instead, to his surprise, the system simply disregarded the part of the paper with ink on it and just graded what was left. Prince Jing was actually the one who made the system, wasn't he? Why was the system always giving him a pass? But thankfully, a partial pass was still a pass. Yes, that's true, the system agreed. However, the reward will also be affected. You can only receive part of it. User, please accept the reward. Protecting the pet fish was the last step of postpartum care. The system tried to keep him guessing by having the reward appear as a large mystery box. Li Yu had been assuming he would be able to turn into a human now, but the reward seemed different from what he had imagined. What would a partial reward be? Could it be that he would turn back into a half-human, half-fish? Then he might as well continue being a fish. The system comforted him, saying, "Please relax, user." Li Yu accepted the reward cautiously, expecting to be scammed. A dazzling white box enveloped him. When it dissipated, 2 new scales appeared next to the jade scale that allowed him to transform into a human. Li Yu glanced at the description. The 2 new skills were turn into a manmer and turn into a merman. He paid special attention to the duration of all his skills. The duration had also changed. It was now 24 hours, a whole day. It could be used once a day and could also be canceled. The addition of the 2 skills meant that the system had given him the ability to transform into different forms. He could transform as he needed, and even though he hadn't turned fully back into a human, transforming once a day for an entire day was basically the same as being fully human again, as long as there weren't any accidents. As for the other forms, he could turn into a fish to avoid danger, and since the manmer and merman forms wouldn't be used daily, he could have fun with them in the privacy of his room. A merman was a different type of flavor, after all, and he wanted to try it out again. Li Yu felt that these new skills were somewhat similar to the way he'd continuously changed forms on the 3rd day of the Protecting the Pet Fish mission. During the mission, though, he changed forms too easily, and he'd almost lost control of it. The new skills required him to choose to press the jade scales to use them, which was much more reliable than changing at will. Plus, the jade scales could only be used if Li Yu was the one to press them. Even though Prince Jing could see them, the scales wouldn't be triggered if he did it. To anyone else, it was basically a tattoo. 2 new skills and a change to the duration of the transformation were the first part of the mystery box of rewards. The mystery box had a second set of rewards, presented by a cute fish-shaped symbol. After he collected the first batch of rewards, Li Yu found that other than the main quest and side quest categories, there was another fish children status that had appeared. "What's this for? Does it have to do with Dabao and the others?" Li Yu asked curiously. Though the children were considered part of Li Yu's team after they hatched, Li Yu hadn't experienced any benefits of being on a team. The children were just a few simple fish-shaped symbols, and Li Yu suspected that these were just decorations. Since there was now a fish children status, the system asked him to check it out. When it expanded, there were 4 fish children symbols. Li Yu thought about it for a moment, then pressed the golden symbol that represented Dabao. A transparent box popped up, showing Dabao sleeping as Wang Gonggong placed a small blanket on him. Was this? Li Yu's little heart was pounding, and he happily clicked on Subao. The fish babies were usually doing the same thing at the same time. Since Dabao was sleeping, so was Subao. But Subao was sleeping on Ye Qinghuan's stomach, with Arbao and Sanbao next to him. The 3 children and Ye Qinghuan were fast asleep. Subao was soundly sleeping, his mouth opening and closing repeatedly. He probably still thought he was a fish and was imagining blowing a bubble. Li Yu checked on the fish children one by one. He couldn't look away. The system took some time to explain. The user can check the current status of the young fish here. It only works with the ones on your team and can be used up to 3 times a day for each young fish. Li Yu's eyes lit up with excitement. Wasn't this the fish scamming system's version of a baby monitor? One where you could see the fish babies. He'd fallen into the bandit's trap because he couldn't ascertain the children's safety and acted impulsively. In the end, it was because communication in ancient times was inconvenient. Really, the best you could do was shout. If it could be like the modern world he came from, with well-developed communication tools like a phone where one could make a quick phone call to see if the children were safe, how could those criminals have taken advantage of him? Though the system hadn't rewarded him with a phone, it gave him the opportunity to see his children whenever he wanted to. Even if there were only 3 chances a day for each child, it was the best reward for a fish father who often worried about his children. Many thanks, system. From the bottom of his heart, Li Yu was grateful. However, the system had more to say. User, postpartum care is only partially completed. This was supposed to be the last of the main missions, but since it was only partially completed, the requirements for closing out the main line have not been met. After the system's assessment, a new main line of missions will be added to make up for it. The reward that the user was not able to obtain can also be obtained after completing the new main missions. He really wanted to take back his thanks. He'd thought he would be able to become human after completing these missions and could finally escape the system, but he still had to complete moped system missions? No matter what form you're in, the user is the user. This will definitely be the last main quest line. After completing these missions, there will be no more. The user can choose a side mission to complete as required, and failing the side mission will have no negative consequences. Okay, that sounded pretty good, actually. Li Yu wanted to be rid of the system because he didn't want to complete missions all the time and worry about failing them. If he could just do missions at his leisure in the future, then it didn't really matter if the system was there or not. Besides, he'd gotten used to the system talking to him and giving him weird power-ups. Since there are still main missions, you should hurry up and assess, said Li Yu mischievously. Don't get in the way of me completing missions and receiving rewards. The system seemed bemused. Oh, and one more thing, Li Yu asked, stammering a little. Can the system see Prince Jing and I when we... When Li Yu was thinking clearly, he was actually pretty smart, even if his reaction time was a little slow. But he was only just considering this issue. There was no privacy with the system. The system was just a system. Li Yu wasn't worried about it being awkward, but he was worried about Prince Jing's secrets being stored in the system. Would they end up turning into viral videos? So, was he watching, or watching? The system had nothing to say. The extremely ridiculous user was kicked out. Li Yu woke up in a great mood. He lost consciousness every time he entered the system, and this time he'd entered as a merman. When he came to, he was sitting in Prince Jing's arms, carefully protected. The merman form's tail was easily dehydrated, so Li Yu impatiently turned back into a human. But his timing was a bit off. Originally, his tail had been cutely wrapped around Prince Jing, but when it turned into legs, it was in a weird position that made his imagination run wild. Li Yu blushed and lowered his legs from around Prince Jing's waist. Then he looked up to meet Prince Jing's eyes. Prince Jing smiled and touched Li Yu's face. What's wrong? Li Yu hugged him and nuzzled up to him, unable to control his happiness. Your Highness, I have good news for you. The duration of my human form has been extended, and after one more tribulation, I can return... It suddenly occurred to him that this explanation wasn't quite right. No matter what progress he'd made with the missions, he was still just a carp spirit to Prince Jing. A carp spirit would want to turn into a human completely, not return to human form. He couldn't get that wrong. Li Yu paused and tried again. Next time, if I pass through the next tribulation, I'll be a human forever. Prince Jing smiled slightly and nodded. All right, I'll protect you during the next tribulation too. Li Yu couldn't help but smile. I'm so lucky you're here, Your Highness, he said, and let out a heartfelt sigh. It was all right even if he had to do one more round of missions. His missions would be completed one day, but he didn't know where he'd be now if not for Prince Jing. Li Yu scooted closer and pulled Prince Jing in. The atmosphere was just right, and the fish was about to kiss him. He exaggeratedly pouted his lips out and kissed Prince Jing's cheek. It was a kiss as light as a feather, making one's heart ripple like water. Prince Jing raised his eyebrows, his lips moving. Do you want to say something, Your Highness? Li Yu asked. He noticed that Prince Jing's expression was a little different. Prince Jing glanced at him quickly and hesitantly took out a note. He made a random guess, but there really was something? Li Yu took the note. He was curious about what Prince Jing wrote, but he only saw Prince Jing's name, Tianchi, on it. I know your name, Your Highness. Why did His Highness want him to see this? Seeing that he still didn't understand, Prince Jing took Li Yu's reddened lips into his and bit down softly when he said, Your Highness. Li Yu, confused as he was teased, said again, Your Highness. Prince Jing sidled up to him before he finished speaking, and Li Yu got bitten again. Your... Prince Jing hugged him and bit once more. Li Yu didn't dare speak anymore and blinked. Was he not allowed to say Your Highness? He was going to be kissed every time he did? Prince Jing, seeing that he was starting to understand, handed him the note with his name on it again. Li Yu suddenly got it. No. Are you asking me to call you by your name? Prince Jing nodded seriously. He finally got it right. Tears sprang to Li Yu's eyes. Prince Jing wanted him to call him by his name. That was perfectly normal, since they were married now. It seemed a bit distant to be calling him Your Highness all the time. Prince Jing didn't want him to be distant. Then, Tianchi. Li Yu smiled shyly. Prince Jing's name was quite tasteful, so he couldn't help saying it again after the first time. Tianchi. Prince Jing responded. A smile spread across his face, and he held Li Yu's hand. It was such a small thing. Why not write it out? Because he wanted Xiao Yu to realize it himself. He didn't want to ask for it. If he could say Xiong Feng's name so easily, then why not his too? Chapter 102. Fish Babies Write a Letter. The last line of main mission still hadn't been revealed yet, so Li Yu didn't have any tasks he had to run around completing. Prince Jing's manor was managed well by Wang Xi, and he didn't have much to do as the consort. He just had to educate the children every day and give Prince Jing some ideas from time to time. From this angle, life was still the way he liked it and hadn't changed just because he became a consort. This was the kind of life he always wanted, and it was also a result of Prince Jing's doting. Prince Jing did whatever he asked. Judu roast duck restaurant was open for him simply because he said he wanted to eat it. Now, it had become a famous delicacy known far and wide, and even the Duke of Chang'an's son from the capital praised it wholeheartedly. The days passed quickly. With Prince Jing's hard work, the locusts, which was a major threat on the western border, had been eradicated, and another major threat, the bandits, were too dead or injured to cause any more trouble. The western border was now stable, and there was much less chaos near the border. In the blink of an eye, the little fish babies turned 100 days old. Prince Jing held a celebration for them, just like a wedding. There was a huge banquet, and numerous guests were invited, a lively scene. After 100 days, Ye Qinghuan came to say goodbye. Ye Shizhe had come to visit partially because the House of Chang'an wanted him to, and he'd asked the emperor especially for the time off. He'd helped Prince Jing a lot during the 100 days he'd been here, but since his wife was pregnant and the bandits Prince Jing was dealing with were pretty much gone, it was time to leave. Before he left, Prince Jing had a deep talk with Ye Shizhe and told him that he wanted to write a letter of gratitude for him to bring back. Ye Qinghuan had a good relationship with Prince Jing. He agreed readily. When Prince Jing was writing the letter, Li Yu and Wang Xi came to visit with 2 children each in their arms. The human-shaped fish children had accepted reality and were living happily, except for Dabao, who still had his reservations. They ate and slept and pooped every day. Dabao, who just wanted to grow up, felt himself going numb. No matter how unhappy he was, all he could do was cry. But if he cried too much, his fish dad would start to feed him milk again, and Dabao hated drinking milk from the bottom of his heart. He missed the fragrant, sweet peach blossom pastry dearly. Unfortunately, he'd heard the wet nurse say that babies needed to drink milk for 6 months before they could eat other things. Dabao used all his fingers and toes and still didn't manage to count 6 months. And he felt like the peach blossom pastry was getting farther and farther away. He didn't really get it, and he couldn't understand why his younger brothers accepted it so readily, especially Subao. That fish was never worried. Dabao was right next to Subao at the moment, and Subao, who was being held by their fish dad as well, was currently munching on his hands. Dabao admired him for that, and his baby instincts made him want to lift his own chubby fingers and shove them into his mouth. No, Dabao told himself repeatedly. I'm a responsible older fish brother and can't eat my hands like my younger brother is doing. But my mouth is itchy and I want to chew. Dabao, the most proper baby in the world, was holding himself back so much that he almost shed a tear. Subao was enjoying munching away when he found Dabao looking at him. The naive Subao smiled lazily and warmly at his older brother, smeared his drool all over Dabao's face, and went back to chewing on his fingies. Dabao wanted to cry. Subao's saliva was so gross, but why did he also want to do the same thing? Liu had been watching them secretly for a long time as he held them in his arms, and he couldn't hold back his laughter. When he saw Prince Jing writing the letter, he had an idea. Dabao, Arbao, Sanbao, Subao, why don't we write a letter to Grandpa too, The fish babies didn't know what an emperor was yet. Liu always called the emperor Grandpa in front of them, because that's exactly who he was to them. Dabao nodded quickly, excited. It'd been such a long time since his fish dad called out to him for something other than nursing. Subao was a bit confused and didn't know what writing a letter meant, but he liked his fish dad, so he'd do whatever he wanted him to. He nodded along with Dabao. Tianchi, is that all right? Liu asked, tugging on Prince Jing's sleeve. Prince Jing loved hearing Xiao Yu call him by his name. He smiled and got out of his seat. Liu put the 2 babies on the table as the other babies in Wang Xi's arms cried and fussed, wanting to reunite with the other 2. The children's small bodies wrinkled the high-quality rice paper placed on the table, but Prince Jing, the paper's owner, wasn't distressed by this at all. The children couldn't touch the ink next to the paper, but Prince Jing was astute. He'd had the kitchen mix together some dark, harmless juice for them to use. Liu, who had checked with the wet nurse beforehand, applied the juice on the baby's hands. He'd heard that the emperor would often ask after the children, so Liu thought he might appreciate something the children made themselves. The emperor had also conferred titles onto all 4 of the children, so they already had salaries. Well, dang. They should give thanks to the emperor for the fact that they'd never have to worry about money. Instead of pondering over what gift to send in his children's name, why not let them write a letter with their father? It was a nice idea. The children were placed together on the table and greeted each other with cries of, "Ah!" Their hands were smeared with the ink, and they were all seated on the paper. There was no need to tell them what to do. They all got started immediately. When Dabao was still a tiny fish, he'd seen a lot of words when he followed his father. Dabao thought about it and determined he could probably write the word da out. He started to concentrate on writing. Arbao and Sanbao didn't know what they should do, but when they saw Dabao begin, they followed his example and started to write the same word. Dabao stopped immediately. Ah! No! This was something that only belonged to Dabao. The younger brothers couldn't write it. Dabao used his hands and feet to write R and San hurriedly, then pushed it to his younger brothers. After a moment of contemplation, Arbao and Sanbao decided they didn't like it. They still thought their elder brother's Da looked nicer. Ah! We want older brothers. Arbao widened his eyes. like little glass beads, and Sanbao reached out his chubby fingers. Their wells mingled together. Liu almost couldn't breathe from laughter. He turned Dabao, Arbao, and Sanbao away from each other so they could each do their own thing. What kind of proper letter could such tiny babies write? Meanwhile, Subao felt sleepy as soon as he saw the rice paper and was now sleeping face down on the paper with his butt in the air. Which one of them did this child resemble? In the end, Dabao finally wrote the da he remembered, and Arbao and Sanbao both left a handprint. Subao was still sleepy and accidentally left half of his face for his grandpa because he got ink on his cheek. Liu carefully blew the children's letters dry, folded them, and handed it all to Prince Jing. "The Emperor won't be angry, right?" he asked, worried. Prince Jing smiled and shook his head. This fish. He was the one who came up with the idea, but he was also the one worrying about it afterward. Prince Jing put the children's letters with his letter of thanks in a large envelope and entrusted this huge responsibility to Ye Qinghuan. This envelope reset Ye Qinghuan's understanding of a letter. Prince Jing said it was a letter of gratitude. Why was it so thick? He'd always thought Prince Jing was cold and didn't care to please the emperor. Who knew he'd write so much? He was obviously as talkative as Wang Gonggong. Liu prepared a gift for the princess of Jinjue too and asked Ye Qinghuan to give it to her. The princess was pregnant, but he and Prince Jing were far away in the west. Liu probably wouldn't be able to congratulate her in person when the child was born, so he wanted to send gifts to her and the child in advance. He had a craftsman melt the small golden bracelets Dabao and the others wore into a pretty lock charm. There was probably no lack of children's accessories at the house of Chang'an, but Li Yu had heard from Auntie Xu that things that children had worn were touched with good fortune. Since his 4 children were safe and healthy, combining the 4 bracelets together would give 4 times the fortune. To a pregnant woman, there was nothing more important than the safety of the mother and child. Ye Qinghuan accepted the gift on the princess's behalf, his eyes a little red. "Thank you, cousin-in-law." He bowed with full respect. Ye Qinghuan and the princess both knew Li Yu, so they usually called him Li Gongzi or consort. The sudden cousin-in-law surprised him, and he realized that it meant Ye Qinghuan recognized him as part of the family. Li Yu responded happily. Prince Jing glanced at Ye Qinghuan. This younger cousin of his, that he always looked at with slight disdain, was finally a bit more pleasing to the eyes. Ye Qinghuan hurried back to the capital. When the emperor received news from Prince Jing, or more precisely, when he received the letter that came with several more pages of rice paper that the children wrote, he was so excited that his hands started trembling. Prince Jing's children were only 100 days old. Were they able to write letters already? Curiosity piqued, the emperor unfolded the letters. The first piece of paper had a crooked word that looked like oa. The second and third pieces of paper had little handprints, and the fourth one... The emperor couldn't control the smile that rose to his lips. Wasn't this just a little baby's face? With a few drops of saliva, too. He'd never met Prince Jing's children, but he could sense their vivid personalities through these papers. "Luo Zhuisheng, what do you think this means?" The emperor pulled out the first piece of paper again and showed it to Luo Zhuisheng. Luo Zhuisheng looked at it for a bit and shook his head. The emperor read Prince Jing's letter again. At the end, he mentioned that these 4 papers were written by the children. The emperor realized that the first piece of paper must have come from Prince Jing's eldest son, who he'd already named as heir. Luo Zhuisheng immediately said, "Your Majesty, I do not know what the little Shutsa meant when he wrote this word, but in all my life so far, I have never seen a child start writing so young. The little Shutsa will definitely be well educated in the future." Luo Zhuisheng knew the emperor well, so he started praising Prince Jing's heir as soon as he opened his mouth. Of course, he wasn't permitted to casually speak about the royal grandson's future, lest he implies anything about anyone taking the throne from the emperor. But there was nothing wrong with saying he'd be well educated. This resounding flattery hit the emperor in the right spot. and he felt at peace as he admired the oa. He stared at it for a long time. He even wanted to ask Luo Zhuisheng to frame it and hang it in Tianqing Palace. Prince Jing's shizi was so promising that it made the emperor think of the 7th and 8th princes in the palace. The 2 princes were still studying in the imperial study room. The emperor paid a visit himself to encourage them gently and give them a lot of homework, which included writing. An emperor's son couldn't do worse than an emperor's grandson who wasn't even a year old yet, right? The little princes were suddenly burdened by homework and had no idea why. Not only was the emperor pleasant and cheerful to the 7th and 8th princes, but he also decided to choose the 2 most excellent students from the Hanlin Academy as future teachers for Prince Jing's children. Prince Jing had originally chosen a couple of teachers from the capital, but they weren't going to be needed anymore. News of the emperor's preparations made its way to the west. Li Yu was a bit speechless when he heard. Wasn't the emperor doting on these babies too much? Tianchi, what does the oa that Dabao wrote mean? Li Yu couldn't help but quietly ask Prince Jing. Why does the emperor like it so much? Prince Jing shook his head. He didn't know either. When he heard his father's talking, Dabao looked at his tender little hands and felt sorry for himself. Oa? He'd clearly written Da for Dabao. All right, folks, that concludes the reading of chapters 97 through 102, and they were so cute. So many lovely things about these past few chapters. I loved the mission of protecting him while he goes through his tribulation, even though he only passed it with a yellow. But it was funny watching Li Yu go from man murder merman, merman to man merman. That was quite funny. And, I totally feel him on the fatherly instincts of, continuously hearing the baby crying and being like, okay, I need to go see what's happening to save this baby, totally understand. One thing I will say, though, about that whole section is it was actually kind of sad to see that Li Yu thought he deserved to be hit. And I know, it said right before that he thought domestic violence was not okay. But it still kind of hurt my heart a little bit for him to think that he did deserve to be hit, because the 2 things seemed kind of contradictory. Okay, it's not okay, and yet you think you deserve it? Okay, so where did this mindset come from? Or is this just some kind of mindset that you've adapted since you're in ancient times, and that hitting maybe was more acceptable? Is it because of Prince Jing's status, or is there something else that maybe came from your previous life? Anyway, that was a little disconcerting. Nevertheless, I want to go back to page 246 for you all, when it had mentioned why he'd gotten a yellow on the whole mission of protecting the pet fish, and it was asking, did did the system think that they were too horny? Which was also interesting, by the way. I'm trying to picture that in my head. But anyway, for those of you who may not understand why that, yellow and the correlation of sex and all of that stuff came up, that's because in China, yellow or huang is like a euphemism for pornographic material and erotica and stuff like that. And so they often refer to, erotica like huangshu, which is the yellow book. So since they scored a yellow, that's why he thought that. And I just thought the system was hilarious, thinking, the hell is wrong with this user? That was so funny. Sorry, I just slapped my chest. It was too hilarious. Anyway, going on to the system, since we're talking about it, I think what the system gave Li Yu was so nice, of basically having those baby monitors. Oh my gosh, that was just such a sweet thing. And even though Li Yu ended up wanting to maybe take his thanks back, I still think that was such a lovely thing or reward for him to get, because we do have those luxuries in modern times, where it's so much easier to make sure our children are okay and stuff like that. And those are things, so many things that were advantages in, you know, our times or future, however far in the future he was, he doesn't have those in ancient times. So it was so sweet that the system gave him that kind of security for his children. Now, the other thing I wanted to address, well, again, I guess there's a lot about the system this time, but when, you know, he was basically asking the system, like, hey, when we're doing it, can you see? I'm not gonna lie. I've definitely thought about this before when I read SVSSS. I was like, so is the system like just there for all of it? And what does the system think about it? And so when it said, was the system watching, or watching, it came up as watching in regular font, then watching with quotes around it, and then watching in italics. And I was like, I wonder what the 3 watchings mean. And so I thought maybe the first watching was like, okay, the system is just there and it could see it because it sees everything, you know, through through Liyu's eyes. And then I was like, or was it watching as in record keeping? Or was it watching, you know, FYP for your pleasure? That was so good. I'm sorry. They just had me cracking up. And then the last thing I wanted to talk about was Dabao, because Dabao is just so... he's an interesting baby. And, you know, of course, I'm definitely understanding the fact that clearly the maturation of these babies from when they were fish carried over into them in their human form. And it just has to be the case because, like, Dabao is so much more mature than any other baby his age would be, at least in my mind. I mean, maybe, I don't know. We don't know what babies be thinking, right? Because they can't really communicate properly with us. But for him to be like trying to restrain himself from doing baby type things because he's like, I'm the older brother, you know, it's just like, wow, yeah, these babies really truly are smart. And him attempting to write Da for Dabao was just so cute. And even though it turned out as Oa, OA, I think he should still be proud of himself because the emperor loves it. And at the end of the day, that's all that matters. So anyway, I hope you all enjoyed these chapters. Please let me know your thoughts in the comment section because I just felt like these chapters were filled with so many interesting things. And I will see you all next time. Yeah, we are almost done with this book, you guys. And then we're moving on to the final one. I think we have a little bit over 100 pages left. Let's knock it out of the park. Hopefully in 2 to 3 more videos, we'll be moving on to the 4th one. Well, Einiman.